I'm Richard Clarke. I record these talks every day as a way to deepen my inquiry. Listen each day and deepen your own practice. Welcome. I'm reviewing and commenting on the book Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. Today is from Talk 363, Part 7. Questioner: what is spana, shining? Maharshi: aham, I is the self. Aham idam, I am this, or I am that, is the ego. Shining is there always. The ego is transitory. When the I is kept up as I alone, it is the self. When it flies at a tangent and says this, it is the ego. Questioner: is God apart from the self? Maharshi: the self is God. I am is God. I am the self, O Gudakesa, Ahamatma Gudakesa. This question arises because you're holding the ego self. This will not arise if you hold the true self, for the real self will not and cannot ask anything. If God be apart from the self, he must be a selfless God, which is absurd. In this dialogue, Ramana Maharshi is asked about spana, shining, and the nature of God and the self. Spana is a term used by Advaita Vedanta and Ramana to refer to a subtle vibration or pulsation of consciousness. It signifies a kind of shining forth of inner luminosity or subtle awareness that can be experienced during deep states of spiritual practice. It is often characterized as a subtle rhythmic pulsation or vibration that is perceived within oneself when the mind becomes calm and focused. The Maharshi responds by explaining the distinction between the self, I, or I am I, and the ego, I am this, or I am that. Ramana teaches that the self is eternal and continuous, the unbroken awareness of I. This I signifies the pure essence of the self and is unaffected by external identifications or transient attachments. The ego I arises when this pure sense of I is obscured as you incorrectly associate, misidentify your identity with the body, mind, and external phenomena. This leads to the idea of separation, the idea that I am this or I am that. Ramana further says that the shining, spana, is intrinsic to the self. It is the ever-present luminosity or awareness that underlies all experience. This shining is not dependent on external factors, but remains constant and unchanging within the self. It shines by its own light, the light of consciousness. The questioner then asks whether God is separate from the self. Ramana responds emphatically that the self is God. Ramana says, I am is God. He emphasizes that God is inherent within the self. Thus, realizing the self is realizing God. This is why when Ramana has been asked how to find God, he would respond, know yourself. The Maharshi challenges the idea of a God apart from the self, stating that if God were separate, he would be a God without a self, which just does not make sense. God without knowing consciousness is what God without a self means. This is nonsensical. According to Ramana Maharshi, the real self, the pure awareness denoted by I, transcends any dualistic conceptions. The real self does not engage in questionings, as it stands beyond the domain of duality and conceptualization, stands beyond ignorance and understanding. With no ignorance, no question arises. This dialogue teaches that the seeker, that you, must transcend the ego self and abide in the unchanging awareness of the self. I. You get past the ego by knowing what you actually are and always have been. By realizing the self is God, you find self-knowledge and bring liberation from the illusion of separateness. You recognize the eternal unity within all existence and realize this as yourself. How can you be different from what is? Ramana Maharshi's teachings in this dialogue highlight the unbroken awareness of the self, I, and its intrinsic luminosity, spana, within, and the identification of the self with God. This understanding leads you to self-knowledge and the realization of ultimate truth. This is liberation from the transient and illusory ego self. Ego is just a transient appearance within the self, which always shines without disturbance. So know yourself and be always free and at peace. The book, Who Am I with Comments, is my take on these early teachings of Ramana Maharshi. It's available on Amazon, free to Kindle subscribers. A link is in the video notes. These videos bring Ramana's teachings into your direct experience. Click subscribe to see more. Click thumbs up to like, and send questions and start a dialogue with a comment.